The gate was a lattice of rusted wire, wide enough for the wind to whistle through, but too narrow for escape. On the other side, the prisoners trudged forward in uneven lines. Hundreds of men in torn, sun-bleached uniforms, their boots caked with the dust of island roads. Their faces bore the flat, gray fatigue of men who had marched too long and surrendered too recently. The heat clung to them like a second skin. The march from the docks to the camp had been short, but their bodies felt stretched thin, as though every step pulled another thread loose. One man stumbled, and no one reached out to catch him. The air between them was dense with silence, an unfamiliar, collective uncertainty. At the far end of the compound, low buildings waited, their wooden frames and metal roofs unlike anything the soldiers had known in the jungles. From the outside they looked ordinary, until they noticed the pipes. Fat steel lines ran like veins across the structure, feeding into rows of fixtures that gleamed in the sunlight. The guards, sharp in their khaki uniforms and pressed caps, barked clipped commands in English. The prisoners did not understand the words, but they understood the gestures. Keep moving, stay in line. They entered the building and froze. Steam curled from the ceiling like ghostly fingers. Dozens of nozzles jutted from the pipes, perfectly aligned. Beneath them, grated floors and drains yawned, waiting. To men accustomed to bathing in rivers, if they bathed at all. This space felt less like a washhouse and more like a factory. A ripple of unease moved through the crowd. Shoulders stiffened. Some prisoners shifted their weight to the balls of their feet, ready to react if this was something else. A trick. A humiliation. The stories whispered in foxholes returned with venom. The Americans are merciless. They treat prisoners worse than dogs. A sergeant from Kyushu whispered something to the man beside him. No one laughed. The guards raised their voices. "Clothes off!" one shouted, gesturing with a quick, precise motion. Belts clinked. Boots scuffed the concrete. The order repeated, impatient, rhythmic. Under the pressure of rifles and stares, buttons unfastened. Uniforms that had clung to skin for months peeled away. The prisoners stood bare beneath the buzzing lights, stripped not only of cloth but of the last thin shield of dignity they had carried from the battlefield. The humidity wrapped around their skin like judgment. The guards handed out bars of soap, dense, pale bricks that smelled faintly of chemicals. Some of the men hesitated to touch them. The hiss came first, sharp and sudden, like the opening of some unseen valve. A chorus of pipes groaned, and from above, water began to fall in perfect streams. For an instant, panic flickered. Shoulders flinched. One man jerked backward, colliding with another. But there was no sting of gas, no burn, no cruelty. Just heat. Gentle, steady heat cascading down their backs, their arms, their faces. The sensation was alien. Many of them had not felt warm water on their skin since leaving home. A few had never experienced it at all. The grime of months loosened under the steady pressure, bleeding away into the drains like ink. One prisoner closed his eyes without meaning to, letting the water find the scars on his shoulders. Around him, others moved cautiously. Some rubbed the soap with stiff hands, uncertain if they were truly permitted to use it. Others stared at the drains, as though expecting them to reveal some hidden cruelty. Minutes passed. The storm of fear that had bristled in their chests began to quiet. Conversations did not bloom, not yet, but breathing slowed, and the rigid lines of their shoulders eased. The hiss of water became a strange kind of silence. For the guards, this was nothing but protocol, a line in a manual, a sanitary routine to keep disease from spreading through the camp. But for the prisoners, it was a disorienting crack in everything they had been told. A young mechanic from Yokosuka tilted his face toward the nozzles, watching droplets catch the light. He remembered leaflets dropped over the jungles. Propaganda, they had said. Images of smiling prisoners receiving food and rest. He'd called them lies back then. Now he felt the warmth soak into his bones, and could not help but wonder if those leaflets had been more truth than deceit. After the water came the towels. They were stacked neatly by the door, white as bone, folded with an almost ceremonial precision. Thick cotton, clean, foreign. The prisoners reached for them tentatively, fingertips grazing the fabric as though expecting it to vanish. The moment they pressed the towels against their faces, the texture jolted through them, soft, absorbent. Nothing like the coarse rags of their own army barracks. For some, it awakened old memories of homes left behind. The smell of soap on skin was enough to summon ghosts. As they shuffled out of the washhouse, dripping and pink from the heat, the air between them had changed. Not warm, not friendly, but cracked open just enough for bewilderment to seep in. They sat in their barracks in silence, uniforms folded at their feet, hair still damp. No one spoke of what had happened, but each man carried the same quiet thought. The enemy had given them comfort, not cruelty. It was a fragile realization, a whisper beneath the noise of war, but it stayed with them long after the steam had faded from the shower hall. That night, as the camp settled beneath the soft rasp of wind moving through the wire fence, the barracks remained heavy with unspoken questions. Dozens of men lay on their cots, their damp hair leaving faint dark rings on the rough canvas. The scent of soap still clung to them, sharp and strange. No one talked openly at first. The silence stretched thin, brittle. But silence never holds forever. A low whisper emerged from the corner of the room, carried like smoke. "Gas," someone said. The word floated through the darkness, soft but poisonous. It drew a few heads up from their cots. The whisper traveled from one bunk to the next, picking up fragments as it went. They spoke of the showers, not as relief but as traps. Some had heard rumors before surrender. Enemy camps where pipes carried death, not water. None of them knew exactly where those stories came from. But in the dark, uncertainty swelled like a tide. A sergeant with a scar across his jaw leaned forward, voice low. "They will kill us slowly. Make us relax first." His tone carried the conviction of a man who'd seen too much to trust kindness. Others nodded silently. The showers had felt too strange, too indulgent. Clean water, hot water, thick towels. Why would an enemy waste such resources on those they had defeated? Their officers had told them Americans were cunning, ruthless beneath polished manners. Another prisoner muttered about the Germans, stories half heard through wartime channels. "They make prisoners bathe before they—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The youngest among them, barely out of training school when he was captured, clenched his fists around his blanket. The image of the pipes hissing overhead replayed in his mind, each droplet of water suddenly sinister. Above their heads, a single bulb flickered, buzzing softly. The barracks were warm, but their thoughts turned cold. The next morning, the guards barked the same orders. "Line up. March to the wash house." The moment the prisoners saw the building again, the unease tightened its grip. Some slowed their steps, others glanced toward the perimeter fence as if measuring distance, though there was nowhere to go. At the doorway, steam billowed like a living thing. It might as well have been fog from another world. The same pipes, the same nozzles, the same routine. But now every gesture carried an undertone of threat. When the guards handed out soap, some prisoners took it with shaking hands. One man held it as though it were a live grenade. "They want us clean," a corporal whispered hoarsely, "so no one knows what happened after." When the water hissed to life, several men flinched. A few barely wet their skin, rubbing the soap across their arms as fast as possible. Some didn't wash at all, just stood beneath the water, waiting, half expecting it to change, to burn, to suffocate them. The guards, frustrated by their hesitation, repeated the orders. "Wash, wash!" one of them shouted in accented Japanese. Another used gestures, scrubbing his own arm as a demonstration. But mistrust is a stubborn thing. It does not dissolve like dirt in warm water. Among the prisoners, small knots of resistance formed. Not open defiance, but a quiet refusal to trust. They washed their hands but not their hair, their arms but not their backs. One man tried to step out early. A guard shoved him back under the nozzle with the blunt end of a rifle. The soap slipped from his palm and spun across the floor. Later, back in the barracks, this incident became a new thread in the fabric of rumors. "You see," someone muttered, "they keep us there to control us." The fear had less to do with what had happened, and everything to do with what could happen. In war, rumor becomes armor. Days passed, and the showers became part of their lives, but not in the way the Americans intended. For the guards, this was practical hygiene. For the prisoners, it was an enigma, a ritual soaked in doubt. Why hot water? Why towels? Why make them cleaner than they'd been in their own army? No one could find an answer that didn't taste like a trap. Every evening, after the lights went out, voices rose from the dark like insects churring in tall grass. One man insisted the soap was laced with something, a slow-acting poison. Another argued that the Americans were trying to weaken their spirit through comfort. "They soften us," he said bitterly, "until we are no longer soldiers." In their culture, endurance had been a measure of worth. To live in filth and pain was proof of strength. Comfort was the language of weakness. These showers twisted that belief, and so their minds resisted. A few prisoners stared at their clean hands as if they belonged to someone else. To feel good after a moment of enemy control was almost unbearable. Pride recoiled. Shame festered. The guards noticed the hesitation but did not understand it. They shouted more, gestured more, enforced more. Translators explained in clipped, broken Japanese. Mandatory. Hygiene. Disease prevention. But cultural distance is a wide chasm. To the prisoners, these explanations only deepened the strangeness. One afternoon, a prisoner refused to enter altogether. He planted his feet at the edge of the building, jaw clenched, chest heaving. His comrades looked on, hearts pounding, not out of loyalty, but out of the fear of what might follow. A guard approached, voice rising. The prisoner did not move. The guard raised his rifle, not to fire, but to make the message clear. The prisoner stepped inside. Pride bent, not broken. Inside the steaming chamber, the contrast was cruel. The warmth itself was almost gentle, a comfort their own army had never given. Yet that comfort sat like a stone in their throats. A few men closed their eyes beneath the nozzles, letting the water spill down, and for a flickering moment, they remembered home. But when they opened their eyes, they were still prisoners, standing shoulder to shoulder with men who muttered of poison and death. The fear did not vanish with time. It mutated. It burrowed into their routines, turning every bar of soap into a question, every hiss of water into a warning. Even when nothing happened, even when no gas came, no cruelty emerged, the mistrust grew its own roots. It was easier to believe in cruelty than to accept an unexpected kindness. At night, conversations turned sharp, whispered so softly they could have been breaths. "Americans are fat," one man said. "They can afford to waste everything, even on us," another spat quietly. "This is not kindness, it's control. They make us depend on their system." An older soldier lay still on his cot, staring at the ceiling, his voice flat. "Or perhaps they just don't care. We are not even worth their hatred." That thought was worse than the others. The paranoia took shape like a living thing in the barracks. It didn't need facts. It didn't need proof. It fed on pride, shame, and the memory of what they'd been told before surrender. The enemy is cruel. If you are captured, you will be humiliated. And yet, when they walked out of the showers each morning, the towels were still folded. The water was still warm. The soap still smelled the same. No harm ever came. But mistrust has its own momentum. It does not require reality to thrive. It only needs the echo of fear. The showers stopped being a surprise after the first week. Fear didn't disappear overnight. It simply folded itself into the rhythm of their days. At dawn, the clang of the bell echoed across the compound, sharp and metallic, scattering the last traces of sleep. The men stirred from their cots like a single, weary organism. Roll call. Head count. March. The path to the shower hall became worn into the dirt, marked by the scuff of hundreds of boots. The first mornings, their steps had been hesitant, full of sidelong glances at the guards. By the seventh morning, hesitation had turned to something else. Not trust, but a dull acceptance. The Americans barked orders with the same clipped precision every day. Line up, move, strip, wash. Their words were almost ritualistic, a chant of control. The steam waiting inside the wooden structure became as much a part of the prisoner's world as the barbed wire itself. One by one, the men entered the shower hall. The pipes hissed awake, their breath filling the chamber. Water fell in synchronized streams, hitting shoulders and backs with the same steady rhythm. For the guards, it was just procedure, no different from issuing rations or checking bedrolls. But for the prisoners, it was an act that marked time, that carved the endless days into predictable segments. Not all obeyed easily. Some still resisted in quiet ways, washing only their hands, keeping their hair dry, standing stiffly with soap untouched in their palms. Others dragged their feet, hoping to shorten the ordeal. But the guards watched closely. The routine was not a suggestion. It was a rule. Those who tried to skip steps found themselves shoved back under the nozzles. A guard would press the butt of his rifle against a shoulder or tap the floor with his boot in impatient rhythm. "Scrub," an interpreter said in broken Japanese, gesturing firmly. "All. Hair, feet, body." The message was clear. This was not optional. Some prisoners gritted their teeth as they obeyed, feeling their pride erode one layer at a time. It was one thing to be captured. It was another to be bathed like children, monitored like livestock. Yet something else was happening beneath the surface. A slow, imperceptible shift. The lice that had plagued their bodies began to vanish. The sores that had festered from weeks in tropical mud began to heal. Blankets no longer smelled like mildew and sweat. The barracks no longer reeked of rot. It was unsettling. Cleanliness felt like the enemy's language, but it was working. In the early days, some had whispered that the soap was poisoned. By the third week, the same men began asking quietly, almost sheepishly, for extra pieces when theirs slipped down the drain. One soldier from Nagoya, who had spent months in the jungles of the Philippines, noticed that his legs no longer burned at night from festering wounds. Another found himself scratching less, sleeping deeper. They didn't speak these things aloud. Admitting improvement would have meant acknowledging that the enemy's system was not only efficient, but perhaps, in its own way, merciful. That was a thought too difficult to name. The process became mechanical. They stripped, washed, dried, dressed, and returned to the barracks. The guards' footsteps echoed against the concrete like metronomes, keeping time. A translator, a thin man with a nasal voice, walked up and down the line, repeating the same phrases day after day. Wash, clean, no sick, good. His accent twisted the words, but the meaning was understood. Disease would not be allowed to spread. Medics followed, checking seams of clothing, running gloved fingers along collars, inspecting hairlines for lice. If a man failed inspection, he was pulled aside for delousing. Powder puffed into the air like chalk. The prisoners hated the inspections. They hated the scrutiny, the way it stripped away what little privacy remained. But slowly their bodies changed. Even those who clung fiercely to bitterness could not ignore the evidence written on their skin. One corporal, a quiet man who had once marched across Guadalcanal, watched his legs heal where ulcers had once eaten into flesh. He didn't smile. But in the darkness of the barracks, he traced the new skin with his fingertips. A mechanic who had coughed every night through the jungle rains found his lungs clearing. A farmer from Hokkaido who had scratched at lice for months now slept through the night without waking in a frenzy. They did not thank their captors. They didn't even speak of it. But these private observations gathered like rain in a barrel, drop by drop. The Americans did not understand the storm that brewed beneath the surface of obedience. To them, hygiene was practical, a simple matter of keeping disease out of the camp. But to the prisoners, the showers were both humiliation and undeniable evidence of an order that worked in ways their own army never had. In the Japanese ranks, cleanliness had once been tied to ritual, to hot springs and village baths, to moments of shared quiet. War had burned that away. Their army had taught them that survival came first. That dirt was a mark of endurance. That filth proved a man's strength. Now, the enemy was teaching them something else entirely. That discipline could also mean comfort. That cleanliness could be enforced with the same precision as a rifle drill. Not everyone accepted it quietly. One morning, a young prisoner refused to wash properly. He dragged the soap across his arms once and stepped back, water still running down his unwashed hair. A guard noticed. He barked an order. The prisoner didn't move. The guard stepped forward, voice sharp, face hard. There was a shove, a stumble, the sharp sound of water splattering on the floor. The prisoner found himself pinned beneath the shower again, the guard's rifle butt nudging against his shoulder like a blunt reminder, obey. It was a small humiliation, but in war, even the smallest moments cut deep. The daily routine grew rigid. Wake, roll call, showers, inspections. The sound of boots on wooden planks became as familiar as their own breathing. The clatter of pipes hissing to life each morning no longer startled anyone. It became the sound of captivity, the mechanical heartbeat of a world they no longer controlled. Some prisoners began moving before they were ordered, folding their towels in the same way the guards stacked them, scrubbing their hair with practiced hands. The showers had ceased to be a question. They were a fact. With routine came a strange sense of predictability. For men stripped of control, predictability was dangerous. It softened edges they had once hardened with pride. The corporal who had traced the healed skin on his legs began standing taller during inspections. A sailor who had refused soap at first now examined the bars before using them, as if trying to determine which lathered best. They did not smile. They did not laugh. But some of the men left the showers with their heads held slightly less low. The guards noticed the change too. Less shouting was needed. The line moved faster. The translator's broken Japanese was no longer necessary at every turn. The prisoners washed without instruction, like men who had absorbed a command too deep to shake off. Somewhere between fear and resignation, the showers had become a law unto themselves. Yet beneath this mechanical obedience, pride simmered like embers. Some prisoners told themselves they were not giving in, they were surviving. Others whispered that washing was meaningless, that clean skin did not make a free man. But even they lined up when the bell rang. Even they held their towels. Even they scrubbed their hair. The system had sunk its teeth in, not through cruelty, but through rhythm, and rhythm in captivity can be just as powerful as chains. When the barracks finally dimmed each night and the air settled into its soft, rhythmic stillness, Conversations turned inward. No one spoke loudly. Loudness had no place behind barbed wire. But in the low, uneven glow of the overhead bulbs, words traveled like smoke from one cot to another. They didn't talk about battles anymore. They didn't speak of bayonet charges or jungle patrols or the long marches that had drained the strength from their bones. Instead, they spoke about the water. Hot water. For soldiers who had fought on humid islands, who had gone weeks without touching soap, the idea of hot water falling every morning like clockwork felt as foreign as another language. Some still resisted the softness of it. Others, quietly, began to remember. A farmer from Aomori spoke in a whisper. Voice roughened by years of command barked in muddy fields. "When I was a boy," he said, "my father would heat water over the fire. We would take turns bathing in the wooden tub. The house would smell of steam and cedar." Someone a few cots over answered, "In my village, the onsen was at the foot of the mountain. We bathed together. Men, fathers, sons. It was warm, safe," the man trailed off. The word safe hung in the air, delicate as the steam that used to fill those baths. The war had stripped those rituals away. In the jungles of Burma and the Philippines, water was a ration, not a comfort. Soap was a fantasy. Bathing was done in rivers if they were lucky, or not at all. What once had been a cultural ritual became a distant memory, buried under mud and exhaustion. And now, strangely, it was the enemy who had given a piece of that ritual back to them. A mechanic from Yokosuka stared at his hands, now free of the black streaks that had stained them during months of naval service. "Do you remember," he murmured to no one in particular, "when we thought soap was for officers?" A few chuckled softly in the dark, not because it was funny, but because it was true. In their own army, comfort was a privilege reserved for rank, not a right extended to every man. The imperial ethos had taught them that filth was endurance, that to smell of sweat and mud was proof of strength. To bathe was softness. Here that logic was turned upside down. The enemy forced them to be clean. Even the lowest-ranked prisoner was handed the same bar of soap as the next. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. Not all reflections came with ease. Some men clenched their jaws in silence, refusing to give voice to thoughts that felt dangerously close to admiration. An older sergeant lay flat on his cot, staring at the rafters, speaking slowly. "They give us hot water, towels, soap, not to honor us, to control us." His tone was hard, almost defensive. But another voice answered from the dark. "Control or not, it works." Silence fell again. Admitting that the enemy's system worked was like cutting a thread inside themselves. Every culture carries its own understanding of cleanliness. In Japan, it had once been about shared warmth, quiet reflection, and ritual. Bathing was a way to return to oneself, to wash away the weight of the day. In war, that had twisted into something else. Deprivation as proof of loyalty. Now, here in captivity, the showers held no ritual, no spiritual meaning. They were mechanical. Rows of pipes, metal nozzles, drains swallowing the runoff. No privacy, no grace, yet the act itself was inescapably human. The sensation of warmth against their skin, once feared as a trick, had become a daily constant, and with it came unwelcome questions. "What does it mean?" someone asked one night. "When the enemy gives us something our own army did not?" The room went still. The answer was not simple. For many of them, the contradiction cut deep. They had been raised to believe that their nation's strength was unshakable, its discipline unmatched. Yet in these fenced compounds, stripped of rank, stripped of weapons, they had discovered a system that offered more comfort to its prisoners than their own side had given its soldiers. This was not a kindness they could easily accept. It was a truth that felt like a wound. A sailor who had survived the New Guinea campaign recalled how his unit had shared a single rusted basin for 30 men. "We didn't bathe," he said softly. "We just splashed our faces, wiped the dirt, and then we marched." Someone else whispered, "In Manchuria, we wore the same socks until they froze to our feet." Some never walked again. The stories spread slowly, layering over one another. Fleas, lice, open sores that turned into fever, skin infections that claimed more men than bullets. The showers in the American camp had washed away more than dirt. They had stripped away illusions. They began to notice things. The coughing that had rattled the barracks when they first arrived faded to almost nothing. The endless scratching at lice-infested scalps stopped. Blankets smelled faintly of soap instead of mold. Wounds healed faster. These changes spoke a language louder than propaganda. Some tried to ignore it, wrapping themselves in pride. Others, silently, began to wonder if the strength they'd been taught to worship had simply been neglect dressed as honor. The guards, of course, saw none of this. To them, it was just hygiene. Routine, efficient, impersonal. But for the prisoners, it carried weight far heavier than the bars of soap they held in their hands. Every towel folded at the doorway was a quiet challenge to their old beliefs. Every steady stream of warm water made the gulf between their past and present impossible to ignore. One night, as the rain beat softly against the roof, an infantry officer, once loud, now subdued, spoke with the quiet gravity of a man unraveling. "We thought they were beasts," he said. "We were told to fight until death because capture was worse. But what if—" he paused. "What if some of what we believed was wrong?" No one answered him. Some stared at the floor. Others stared at nothing at all. The thought was too dangerous to hold for long. Not everyone accepted these reflections the same way. Some resisted, clinging fiercely to the idea that kindness from the enemy was manipulation. "They soften us," one soldier growled. "They want us to forget who we are." But others, especially the younger ones, didn't see it as softness. They saw it as proof of something they had never imagined before. The scale of the enemy's power. If the Americans could afford to give hot water and soap to prisoners, what did they give their own soldiers? That thought, more than anything else, revealed the distance between two worlds. As the weeks passed, conversations changed shape. Jokes, awkward, almost guilty, appeared around the subject of showers. A man might say, "I never smelled this good in uniform," and someone else would mutter, "Don't get used to it," though the corners of their mouths sometimes twitched, just slightly. Humor, quiet and dry, became a way to survive the contradiction. They also began to reflect on themselves in a new light. Their hair grew softer from the constant washing. Their skin cleared. They felt stronger, even if they hated to admit it. The physical transformation mirrored something quieter, more dangerous, a shift in the way they saw their captors, and themselves. For some, this shift was terrifying. To feel better in enemy hands than under their own banner felt like betrayal. For others, it was a quiet awakening, like a door opening to a world they hadn't known existed. What they didn't understand at first, but would later remember, was how subtle this transformation was. The enemy had not forced belief upon them. The enemy had simply enforced routine. The water did the rest. They had entered the camp carrying hatred, fear, and an unshakable belief in their own narrative of the war. Slowly through the hiss of pipes and the weight of towels, those beliefs cracked. Not shattered, just cracked. Enough for light to get in. By the time the wind shifted to cooler nights, they no longer whispered about gas or poison. They no longer eyed the showers as a trap. But the silence that replaced those fears was not comfort. It was something far more complex. They were beginning to understand, not accept, but understand, that the world outside their beliefs was larger than they had imagined. The showers had not broken their pride, but they had forced it to look at itself. Years later, when the war was over and the fences had long since been taken down, memories of captivity lived in the quiet corners of their minds. Some recollections blurred with time. The faces of guards, the endless roll calls, the smell of damp wood in the barracks. But one image refused to fade: the showers. For many, it wasn't the fear they remembered first, though the fear had been sharp at the start. It wasn't even the humiliation of lining up naked under watchful eyes. What endured was something simpler and stranger: the sensation of hot water pouring down after months of living in dirt. The sound of pipes hissing still echoed in their dreams. Steady, mechanical, unchanging. In the stillness of their later years, that sound carried an entire story. It spoke of the moment they realized the enemy they had been taught to hate could be organized, disciplined, and disturbingly humane. Some spoke of it openly to their families. A former sergeant, years older and with silver streaking his hair, once sat at a low table, describing to his son how the Americans forced them to bathe. The boy laughed at first, thinking it was a joke. How could something so ordinary be worth remembering? But as the man continued, the weight in his voice became clear. "It wasn't like home," he said. "It was steel pipes, hot water from nowhere, soap in our hands whether we wanted it or not. I thought they meant to kill us, but they just made us clean." His son didn't know what to say. The war his father had lived through belonged to another world. Others never spoke of it at all. For them, the memory of the showers carried a sting that had nothing to do with water temperature. It was a reminder that the life they had fought to defend, the discipline, the hardship, the glory their leaders promised, had not given them what their captors did without hesitation. That truth was too bitter to speak aloud. but it lived quietly inside them, in the spaces where pride and honesty clashed. Historians who interviewed former prisoners decades later noticed something curious. When asked about daily routines in American camps, many brushed past food and labor. But when showers were mentioned, their answers sharpened. "It was strange," said one. "Hot water every day," said another. "They made us wash like it was law." Some described the shock of that first day with uncanny clarity. The fear, the scent of soap, the way steam had curled in the air like breath from an unseen giant. Others spoke of how quickly the ritual became a habit, how they learned to fold towels with the same efficiency as their guards, how the smell of soap came to mean both captivity and survival. The showers had not been intended to carry meaning. For the Americans, it had been procedure, a simple act of sanitation. For the prisoners, it became something else entirely, a mirror. In that mirror, they saw two civilizations side by side. One preached sacrifice and endurance, often leaving its own soldiers to rot in filth. The other, even toward its enemies, enforced a standard of cleanliness not out of kindness, but out of system and order. The reflection was uncomfortable. It forced them to question what true strength looked like. When they returned to Japan, some carried the habit with them like an invisible souvenir. A few, who had never owned soap before the war, began washing daily, insisting their children do the same. "Cleanliness is not softness," one man told his daughter. "It keeps you alive." She didn't understand the weight behind those words, but she remembered the way he said them. Others quietly began to resent the gap between what they'd lived through at the front and what they'd seen in captivity. In private, some admitted that their bodies had been healthier in enemy hands than in their own army's care. That thought carried a shame that never fully healed. There was another layer to the memory, one even harder to name. For many, the showers had been the first moment when they glimpsed the depth of their enemy's power. Not the power of bombs or ships, but the quieter, more insidious power of abundance. The enemy could afford to keep its prisoners clean, to offer soap and hot water not as a gift, but as routine. That realization gnawed at them. It explained victories they had once told themselves were luck. It whispered of a world larger, richer, and more relentless than the one they had fought to defend. In reunions years after the war, when former soldiers gathered in smoky halls, talk would sometimes circle back to the showers. Never as the main topic, never with the same weight as battles or lost comrades, but always there, a thread woven through their shared past. "Do you remember the first day?" someone would ask, and someone else would nod, laughing softly in the way old men do when faced with something they cannot quite explain. "It felt like stepping into another country," another would add. "No," someone else would correct him, "another world." For a few, the memory became a turning point in how they understood power. Strength, they realized, was not just measured in who carried the bigger gun or shouted the loudest order. It lived in systems, in how a nation treated even those it considered its enemies. That realization did not erase their loyalty to their homeland, but it left an indelible mark on how they saw the world. A mechanic who had been captured at 20 wrote in his diary decades later, "The day they made us bathe, I understood nothing. Years later, I understood everything. They didn't need to tell us they were stronger. They showed us." That line, historians would note, appeared in several testimonies in different forms. A shared thought, shaped by steam and soap and the quiet hum of pipes. For many, the war ended not on the battlefield, but in small, unremarkable rituals like this. The daily shower, the folded towel, the warm water that stripped away grime but also illusions. They walked into those showers as soldiers who believed the enemy was monstrous. They walked out as men who could no longer hold that belief intact. The showers did not save them. They did not erase captivity. But they left a scar, clean, precise, unforgettable. And as years folded into decades, that scar became a story they carried with them. A story about the strange, quiet ways a war imprints itself on human lives.